The train groaned. A weary, iron beast surrendering to the end of the line. For 3 days, its rhythmic clatter had been the only constant in Clara's world. A world that had shrunk to the dimensions of a dusty window pane. Outside, the land had bled from green to brown, the trees thinning into skeletal shrubs that clawed at a sky the color of faded denim. Now, the clatter slowed to a series of jarring clanks and hisses, and the dust of Promise Creek, Nevada, settled on the window ledge like a final, gritty verdict. Clara's hands, knotted together in her lap, were damp. She squeezed them tighter, the knuckles white. Her entire world was contained in the small, scuffed valise at her feet. It held 2 worn dresses, a bar of lye soap, a dog-eared copy of a book she could not read, and a small, sharp paring knife wrapped in oilcloth. Everything else she had left behind, or rather, it had been taken from her long ago. She kept her head bowed, her gaze fixed on the warped floorboards, a habit learned in a place where meeting a man's eye was an invitation she could not afford to offer. The brim of her drab bonnet was a shield, casting her face in shadow, making her anonymous. It was the only protection she had left. The carriage emptied around her with a bustle of weary travelers greeting familiar faces. Laughter, loud and jarring, echoed in the small station house. Clara did not move. She waited until the sounds faded, until the silence was broken only by the ticking of a station clock and the distant, mournful cry of the steam engine. She felt 100 pairs of unseen eyes on her, judging her, dissecting her purpose. A woman alone, arriving on the afternoon train with a single bag, was a question mark. And in a town this small, questions were answered with suspicion. Taking a breath that did little to calm the frantic bird beating against her ribs, she rose. Her legs were stiff, her back a single column of pain. She stepped from the train onto the splintered wooden platform, and the heat struck her like a physical blow. It was a dry, punishing heat that stole the moisture from her lips and made the air shimmer. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything. The station house, the water tower, the lone horse tied to a hitching post. It smelled of sun-baked earth, horse manure, and something else, something wild and empty. She stood for a moment, a small, still figure in a landscape built on an immense scale. The town was a mere handful of buildings huddled together against an endless expanse of cracked earth and sagebrush. In the distance, mountains jagged the horizon, their peaks hazy and indifferent. This was it, the edge of the world, the place she had run to, hoping to disappear. A man detached himself from the shadows of the station's overhang. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, and moved with a quiet economy that suggested he wasted nothing, not time, not words, not motion. He wore denim trousers tucked into worn leather boots and a simple cotton shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and baked brown by the sun. His face was weathered, all angles and planes, with a strong jaw darkened by a day's worth of stubble. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, found hers for a brief, assessing moment before he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Miss Miller." His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a dry creek bed. It held no welcome, only confirmation. Clara flinched at the name. It was not hers, not really, but it was the one on the letter. She could only manage a nod in return, her throat too tight for words. This was him, Eli, the name from the advertisement, the man who had paid for her ticket west, her husband. The word felt like a lie in her mouth. He did not smile. He did not offer to take her bag. He simply turned and gestured with his head toward a wagon parked nearby. "This way." The wagon was as practical and unadorned as the man. Its wooden sides were faded and scarred, the wheels caked with dried mud. A sturdy-looking bay horse stood patiently in the traces, flicking its tail at the persistent flies. Eli tossed her valise into the back with a dull thud. then stood waiting for her to climb up. There was a small stool, but he made no move to help her. The lack of courtesy was a strange sort of relief. It was impersonal. It was business. She gathered her skirts and climbed onto the hard wooden bench, keeping to the far edge. Eli swung up beside her, the wagon dipping under his weight. He took up the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the horse into a steady walk. They left the small cluster of buildings behind, the clatter of the wagon wheels the only sound between them. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Clara risked a sideways glance at him. His profile was stark against the vast, empty landscape. His gaze was fixed forward, his hands sure on the reins. He did not seem to feel the need to fill the silence with pleasantries, and for that she was grateful. She had no pleasantries left in her. She had practiced speeches on the train, polite phrases and grateful sentiments, but they had all evaporated in the brutal heat of his presence. He was not a man who seemed to want her gratitude. He seemed to want nothing from her at all. The land they traveled through was unforgiving. It was a place of muted colors, the pale green of the sagebrush, the dusty brown of the earth, the bleached white of a steer skull lying half buried in the dirt. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the wind, when it came, was hot and carried the scent of dust and distant rain that never fell. It was a country that promised nothing but hardship. It felt honest. In a way, it did not pretend to be soft or welcoming. It showed its teeth, and you either respected it or it broke you. As dusk began to bleed across the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, the air grew cooler. A coyote yipped in the distance, a lonely, searching sound that was answered by another, and then a deeper, more chilling sound rose on the wind, the long, howling cry of a wolf. Clara pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The sound seemed to creep under her skin, a primal warning of the wildness that surrounded them, of the isolation that was now her reality. This was a place where a person could vanish, and no one would ever know. Perhaps that was what she had been looking for. After what felt like an eternity, a small cabin materialized in the fading light. It was a simple, sturdy structure of hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a single window that glowed with the warm, flickering light of a lamp. A small barn and a series of corrals stood nearby. There were no other signs of life for as far as the eye could see. The sense of isolation was absolute, a weight that settled deep in her bones. Eli pulled the wagon to a stop and was on the ground before the wheels had fully ceased their turning. He unhitched the horse with practiced efficiency, his movements fluid and sure in the twilight. "I'll tend to the horse. Go on inside. Doors open." Clara hesitated. She slid down from the wagon, her feet sinking into the soft dust. The cabin looked small, too small for two people who were strangers. She clutched her valise to her chest and walked toward the open door, every step an effort. The inside was one room, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A rough-hewn wooden table with two chairs stood in the center. A cast-iron stove was in one corner, and shelves holding a few plates and tins lined one wall. It was clean, sparse, and intensely masculine. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. An oil lamp on the table cast long, dancing shadows. There were two doors leading off the main room. As Eli entered behind her, his large frame seeming to fill the small space, he nodded toward the one on the left. "That's your room. The other's mine." He walked past her, placing a sack of flour on the table. He did not look at her, but addressed the room at large. "There's water in the bucket and wood in the box. Outhouse is out back. I expect meals. Breakfast before sunup, dinner after sundown. You do the cooking, cleaning, mending, tend the chickens. I'll handle the rest." He paused, finally turning to face her. His expression was unreadable in the flickering lamplight. "This is a business arrangement, Miss Miller. Nothing more. The circuit judge comes through twice a year. We'll file the papers then. The folks in town, They expect a man to have a wife. It quiets the talk. To them, you are Mrs. Colton. In this house, you are Miss Miller. You have your room. I have mine. You will not be bothered. He let the final word hang in the air, waited with unspoken meaning. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had prepared herself for anything but this. She had steeled herself for a rough hand, for a man's appetites, for the grim reality of a wife's duties. She had spent the entire train ride building walls inside herself, preparing to endure the unendurable one more time. And now, with a few blunt sentences, he had dismantled her defenses. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her feel weak. But right behind it came a wave of deep, unsettling confusion. He wanted a housekeeper, a shield against gossip, but he did not want a wife. She was to be a ghost in his home, a presence that cooked his meals and then vanished behind a closed door. She did not understand. Men did not pay a woman's passage across the country for appearance's sake. Men had needs. The men she had known always had needs. "Do you understand?" he asked, his voice cutting through her turmoil. She could only nod, her eyes wide in the dim light. "Good," he said. And with that, he turned and went into his room, closing the door softly behind him. Clara stood frozen in the middle of the room, the silence pressing in on her. She was safe. For tonight, at least, she was safe. The realization was so foreign, so overwhelming, that it felt like another kind of danger entirely. She did not know what to do with it. Over the next few days, they settled into a strange, silent routine. Clara rose before the sun, the chill of the high desert air seeping through the cabin walls. She would light the stove, put coffee on to boil, and make biscuits and bacon. Eli would already be outside, his presence announced by the sound of an axe splitting wood or the soft nickering of horses. He would come in as the sun crested the mountains, eat his meal without a word, and leave again. She spent her days exploring her small domain. She cleaned the cabin until the wooden floors shone. She mended the rips in Eli's shirts, her stitches small and neat. She collected eggs from the half-dozen chickens that scratched in the dirt behind the cabin, their clucking a comforting, domestic sound in the vast silence. And she watched him. From the cabin window or the shade of the porch, she watched him work. He moved with a relentless, tireless energy. His main work was breaking wild horses, mustangs he and another rancher rounded up from the hills. It was brutal, dangerous work, and she expected violence. She expected a whip, a spur, a litany of curses, but there was none. Eli's method was patience. He would stand in the center of the corral for hours, letting the horse exhaust its fear, his voice a low, steady murmur. He was firm, unyielding, but never cruel. He communicated with the animals through a quiet strength, a calm that seemed to seep from him and gentle the wildest of spirits. He never raised his voice. He never struck a horse in anger. His quiet manner unnerved her more than any cruelty could have. She knew cruelty. She had a map for it, a list of rules for survival. You made yourself small. You stayed silent. You learned to read the tightening of a jaw, the darkening of an eye, and you braced for the storm. But this was uncharted territory. Eli rarely looked at her, and when he did, his gaze never lingered. It was a glance, an acknowledgement of her presence, and nothing more. He did not try to make conversation. He did not demand she smile. He treated her with a detached respect that felt more like indifference. It left her untethered, uncertain of her place. She did not know what to do with kindness, even a kindness as spare and unadorned as his. The nights were the hardest. The memories she kept buried during the busy daylight hours would surface in the dark. They were not clear pictures, but fragments, sensations, the sharp, stinging pain of a slap, the smell of whiskey on a man's breath, the sound of a key turning in a lock, followed by heavy, stumbling footsteps in the hall, a door slamming shut, the sound echoing the finality of a cage. She would wake up gasping, her heart pounding. the phantom ache of old bruises throbbing in her bones. On those nights, she would reach under her thin pillow, and her fingers would curl around the smooth wooden handle of the paring knife. It was a small comfort, but it was the only one she trusted. A week after she arrived, a storm rolled in. It came without warning, the sky turning from a clear, brilliant blue to a bruised, churning gray in the space of an hour. The wind rose to a howl, rattling the cabin's lone window and driving sheets of rain against the logs. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the small house. Clara was trying to secure a loose shutter when the first bolt of lightning struck nearby. The world exploded in a flash of white, followed instantaneously by a deafening roar that sounded like the sky itself was being torn in two. She cried out, stumbling backward into the cabin, her hands flying to cover her ears. She squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling uncontrollably. She sank to the floor, curling into a tight ball, her mind wiped clean of everything but a primal, consuming terror. The cabin door opened and closed, letting in a gust of wind and rain. She heard his heavy boots on the floorboards. She braced herself, expecting a harsh word, a command to get up, a rough hand on her shoulder. Instead, something heavy and warm settled over her. She flinched, then realized it was his coat. It was heavy with the smell of rain, horse, and the man himself. He had draped it over her trembling form, a makeshift shelter. He did not speak. He did not touch her. He simply stood there, a silent, solid presence in the storm-racked room. Another boom of thunder shook the cabin, and she whimpered, pressing her face against her knees. She felt him move, not away, but closer. He sat down in the chair by the cold hearth, the wood creaking under his weight. He did not say, "It's all right." He did not offer empty reassurances. He simply sat, a silent guardian, and waited with her for the storm to pass. Slowly, shakily, Clara lifted her head. The lamplight flickered, casting his chiseled profile in shadow. He was looking at the fire, his expression unreadable, but he was there. He had not left her alone in her terror. He had covered her with his coat. In the deafening silence between claps of thunder, a tiny, fragile spark ignited deep within her. It was not passion, not affection, not even hope. It was something far more fundamental, something she had not felt in a lifetime. It was the first, tentative flicker of safety. It was born not of words or promises, but in the quiet, unspoken kindness of shared warmth on a stormy night, and for the first time since she could remember. Clara felt the tension in her shoulders ease, just a fraction. She pulled his coat tighter around her and watched the man who was her husband, and she wondered if, just maybe, she had not run to the edge of the world to disappear, but to be found. The days settled into a rhythm, as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. The quiet that had once felt like a threat began to transform, becoming a kind of shield. In the silence, there were no harsh words, no sudden demands, no need for the constant, exhausting vigilance that had been her companion for years. Yet, this new peace was a treacherous country, and Clara walked its borders with caution. A part of her, the wild, cornered part that had kept her alive, remained suspicious. It waited for the other boot to drop. It insisted that this kindness, this respectful distance Eli maintained, was a trick. A debt was being accrued, and at some point, he would come to collect. But the man she watched every day gave her no evidence to feed her fear. He never entered her room. He never spoke to her of anything beyond the practical needs of the day. He never let his gaze linger on her. He treated her not like a wife, not even like a woman, but like a distant neighbor who happened to be sharing his roof. He was a constant, steady presence, as reliable and unchangeable as the mountains on the horizon. And against her will, another part of her began to yearn. It was a small, timid yearning, like the first green shoots pushing through cracked, dry earth. It longed for a word, a look, a sign that he saw her as more than just a pair of hands to cook his meals and mend his shirts. This internal battle left her torn, suspended between the shadows of her past and the unnerving light of her present. 2 weeks after her arrival, the need for supplies became unavoidable. Eli announced it over breakfast, his eyes on his plate. "We're going to town today. I need flour and salt. You can get what you need for the kitchen, and some cloth, if you like." The word sent a jolt of anxiety through her. Town meant people. It meant eyes, whispers, questions. Here, in the isolation of the ranch, she was simply Clara. In town, she would be Mrs. Colton, a woman with a story she did not know how to tell. "All right," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. The ride into Promise Creek was as silent as their first journey from the station, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer empty, but filled with a low thrum of awareness. Clara was acutely conscious of his shoulder just a foot from her own, of the way his large, capable hands held the reins. She stole a glance at him. He seemed untroubled, his expression as stoic as ever, but she sensed a tension in the set of his jaw. He knew this would be an ordeal, too. As they neared the small cluster of buildings, she pulled the brim of her bonnet lower, trying to disappear, but it was no use. Their arrival was an event. Heads turned. Conversations paused. The wagon rolled down the single dusty street under a barrage of curious and judgmental stares. Clara fixed her gaze on her own hands, twisting a loose thread on her dress until it threatened to unravel. Eli pulled the wagon up in front of Henderson's Mercantile, a long, low building with a shaded porch. "I'll see to the grain first," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You can go on in." He swung down and strode toward the feed store, leaving her alone to face the gauntlet. Taking a deep breath, she slid from the wagon bench, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The Mercantile door creaked open, a small bell announcing her arrival. The interior was dim and smelled of coffee beans, dried apples, and bolts of fabric. A few women stood talking by the counter, and their chatter ceased the moment they saw her. They looked her up and down, their eyes lingering on her plain, worn dress. And then they turned to each other, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. Clara's face burned. She walked quickly to the back of the store, pretending to examine tins of peaches. Though she could not read the labels, she felt their judgment like a physical weight. She was the mail-order bride, the silent, strange woman Eli Colton had brought to his isolated ranch. They were filling in the details of her story with their own sordid imaginations. She was a runaway, hiding from the law. She was a fallen woman from the city, bought and paid for. A portly man with a slick of graying hair and a stained apron appeared from behind the counter. "Help you with something?" he asked, his tone suggesting she was an inconvenience. I need some flour and salt," she stammered, keeping her eyes downcast. "Colton's account?" he grunted. She nodded. He began to scoop flour into a sack, his movements slow and deliberate. "Quiet one, ain't ya?" he said, not looking at her. "Most of the new wives, they talk your ear off. Pleased as punch to have a man to look after him. Guess Eli didn't pay for conversation." His words were a slap. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She said nothing, her throat closing up with a mixture of shame and fury. The bell on the door jingled, and Eli stepped inside, his large frame momentarily blocking the bright sunlight. He took in the scene at a glance. Clara, pale and frozen by the back shelves, the whispering women by the counter, and Mr. Henderson, a smirk on his fleshy lips. Eli moved to the counter, his steps silent but commanding. He placed his hands flat on the worn wood. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the store. Mr. Henderson, he said, his tone level. My wife asked for flour and salt. I expect you to provide them, and I expect you to do it with a civil tongue in your head. The shopkeeper's smirk vanished. He looked from Eli's stony face to his large, calloused hands, and a flicker of fear entered his eyes. Now, Eli, I was just making conversation. You were not, Eli stated, the words flat and final. You were being rude. It will not happen again. His voice was not loud, but it had the weight of a coming storm, a low rumble of thunder that promised consequences. Bag the flour, and add a sack of sugar and some coffee. She'll need some blue calico cloth as well, the best you have. Mr. Henderson scurried to comply, his earlier insolence replaced by a flustered haste. The whispering women suddenly found the contents of their baskets fascinating. Clara stood stunned, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one had ever defended her before. No one had ever stood between her and a man's casual cruelty. She had always been expected to absorb it, to endure it in silence. To see Eli do it, with such quiet, unshakable authority, left her breathless. He had not done it for a wife. He had done it for her. The ride back to the ranch was wrapped in a new kind of silence. It was no longer just an absence of words, but a space filled with what had been said in the store. Clara kept replaying the scene in her mind, the sound of his voice cutting through the shopkeeper's smugness. He had called her his wife, and he had said it with a finality that left no room for argument. That evening, after they had eaten their dinner of beans and biscuits, she found the courage to ask. He was cleaning a rifle by the firelight, his movements precise and methodical. She sat at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Eli?" she began, her voice small. He paused, looking up at her. "Why?" she asked, the single word holding a dozen questions. "Why did you defend me? Why did you bring me here? Why this arrangement? Why did you marry me?" He set the rifle down carefully and leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. His gaze was direct, without artifice, and she found she could not look away. "I saw the advertisement you answered," he said, his voice low. "It was from a different agency than the one I wrote to. They'd made a mistake. Your letter, it was short. It said you were a good worker and you wanted a new start, somewhere quiet." He looked into the fire, his expression unreadable. "I figured you needed out from wherever you were, and I needed peace." The simplicity of it was devastating. You needed out. I needed peace. It was not a declaration of affection, but it was a statement of mutual need, an acknowledgement of her own unspoken desperation. He had not bought a wife for his pleasure. He had offered a lifeline to a stranger because he recognized something of his own need for solitude in her. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. A fragile truce settled between them after that. Clara began to take small risks. One morning, she asked him about a brand she'd seen on one of the horses. "That's the Rocking Bee," he said, after a moment's hesitation. "My father's mark." It was a small piece of his past, offered without embellishment, and she treasured it. Another evening, he was telling a dry, understated story about a stubborn mule, and a small, breathy laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. He stopped talking and looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his gray eyes. She immediately clapped a hand over her mouth, her face flushing with embarrassment, but he simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and continued his story. It felt like a monumental step. The summer rains returned with a vengeance a week later. A storm blew in from the west, the wind howling like a banshee and the rain coming down in solid, blinding sheets. In the middle of the night, a steady drip, drip, drip began in the center of the main room. By morning, it was a steady trickle. "Roof's leaking," Eli stated the obvious at breakfast. "We'll have to patch it." The rain let up for a few hours in the afternoon, leaving a gray, dripping world behind. Eli brought a ladder from the barn, and they went to work. He climbed onto the slick, wet roof to find the broken shingles, calling down instructions to her. She was to hand him tools and fresh shingles from the top of the ladder. She held the ladder steady as he climbed, her eyes fixed on his worn boots. Then it was her turn. She gathered a handful of shingles and started up, her wet skirts hampering her movements. Near the top, her foot slipped on a muddy rung. A small cry escaped her as she lost her balance, her arms flailing. She did not hit the ground. Strong hands gripped her waist, stopping her fall. She found herself pressed against Eli's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek, the warmth of him soaking through her damp dress. The world seemed to stop. All she was aware of was the rough texture of his shirt, the scent of rain and clean sweat, and the sheer, unyielding strength in the arms that held her. They both froze. It was the first time they had truly touched, and the contact was a jolt, a flash of lightning in the gray afternoon. She could feel the tension ripple through him, a sudden stillness in his powerful frame. She looked up, her face just inches from his. His stormy eyes were dark, unreadable, but for the first time, she saw something flicker in their depths, something other than detached calm. He set her back on her feet as if she weighed nothing. "Careful," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He did not meet her eyes. He turned and climbed the ladder back onto the roof, his movements stiff. Clara stood trembling in the mud, her hand pressed to her chest where she had felt his heartbeat. The brief moment in his arms had awakened something inside her, a longing so sharp and unfamiliar it was terrifying. It was a hunger for something she could not name, a deep, aching need to be held like that again, not just to be saved from a fall, but to be held. That night, the rain started again, a steady, drumming rhythm on the newly patched roof. She could not sleep. The memory of his touch, of his strength, was a fire under her skin. She rose from her bed and went to the cabin window. A faint light from the barn cut through the darkness. She peered through the rain-streaked glass and saw him. He was out in the downpour, his back to her, mending a section of fence that had been damaged by the wind. The rain plastered his shirt to his broad back, outlining the powerful muscles as he worked, his movements steady and relentless. He was a man who fixed what was broken, whether it was a roof or a fence. He did not complain. He simply did the work. Watching him there, a solitary, determined figure against the storm. Something inside her broke open. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated longing. It was frightening in its intensity, a raw, elemental pull toward the quiet strength of this man. She wanted to run out into the rain and stand with him. She wanted to feel his arms around her again. She wanted things she had long ago taught herself never to want. She stumbled back to her bed, her heart aching with a confusion of fear and desire. She eventually fell into a fitful sleep and dreamed, but for once, it was not a nightmare of slamming doors and harsh voices. She dreamed of her childhood, of a small, sunlit kitchen filled with the scent of baking bread. She dreamed of her mother, a woman whose face she could no longer clearly recall, humming a simple, gentle melody as she kneaded dough. It was a song of safety, of love, of a time before her world had shattered. She woke with a sob, tears streaming down her face. But these were not tears of terror. They were tears of profound loss, of grief for a life that had been stolen from her. Disoriented and aching, she pushed herself out of bed. She did not know what she was doing. She only knew she could not stay in that small, dark room. She opened the cabin door and stumbled outside into the night. The rain had softened to a fine mist. The wet grass was cold and soft beneath her bare feet. She stood in her thin white nightdress, dazed, lost in the ghost of her mother's song. "Clara?" His voice, low and concerned, cut through her reverie. He was standing on the porch, a silhouette against the faint light from the open door. He must have heard her leave. He came down the steps and walked toward her. She braced herself, expecting him to be angry at her foolishness. Instead, he stopped a few feet away, his expression laced with a worry she had never seen there before. Without a word, he shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it gently around her trembling shoulders. It was warm from his body, and it enveloped her in his familiar scent of earth and wood smoke. He placed a hand lightly on her back, not to grab or to pull, but to guide. "Come on," he said softly. "You'll catch your death." He walked her back inside in silence, his hand a steady, warm pressure on her back. He led her to the chair by the hearth and gently pushed her down into it. He then took a thick wool blanket from his own bed and draped it over her, tucking it in around her legs. He moved with a quiet, practiced gentleness that was more comforting than any words could have been. He built up the fire, the flames casting a warm, dancing glow across the room. As he stood to put the poker back, she finally found her voice. It came out as a ragged whisper, filled with all the broken pieces inside her. "I don't know how to be this," she confessed to the floorboards, unable to look at him. "A wife." He was silent for a long moment. She thought perhaps he had not heard her, or that he had no answer. She risked a glance up at him. He was watching her, his stormy eyes filled with a deep, quiet understanding. "Then we'll start with neighbors," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of confusion. He paused, and then added, so softly she almost did not hear it, "Friends, if you'd like." And with those words, he offered her not a command, but a choice. He gave her a path she could walk without fear, a friend, a neighbor. It was a foundation she could build on, a gift of patience more profound than any passion. In the warmth of the firelight, wrapped in his coat and his blanket, Clara felt the last of her suspicion begin to melt away, replaced by the tentative, fragile green shoots of trust. Friends. The word echoed in the quiet spaces of Clara's mind, a gentle, persistent hum. It was a concept she had not considered for herself in a very long time. It was a word that implied equality, a choice, a connection freely given and received. It was a seed that Eli had planted in the barren ground of her heart, and in the weeks that followed, against all odds, it began to grow. The first change was small, almost imperceptible. She began to hum. It would happen when she was kneading dough for the morning biscuits, her hands dusted with flour, or when she was sweeping the cabin floor, the rhythmic motion of the broom a kind of meditation. The tunes were fragments, melodies from a life she could barely remember, the ones from her dream of her mother. They were tentative at first, a breathy, half-formed sound, but they were a sound of peace, of a mind momentarily untroubled. Then came the garden, behind the cabin. There was a small patch of earth that caught the morning sun. One day, on a whim born of a restless energy she did not understand, she took a spade from the barn and began to turn the soil. It was hard, rocky work, and it left her with blisters on her palms and an ache in her back. But there was a deep satisfaction in it, in the feeling of the cool earth under her fingernails, in the simple, honest labor. Eli watched her from the corral, his expression unreadable, but he said nothing. The next day, when she went out, a small pile of rich, dark soil from the creek bed was waiting for her, along with a sturdy new hoe. He never mentioned it. He did not have to. She planted mint, sage, and thyme, nurturing the small seedlings with a fierce, tender care. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could coax life from the unforgiving land. It was the first thing she had ever created for herself, a small green testament to the fact that she was still capable of growth. The blue calico cloth Eli had insisted Mr. Henderson add to their supplies lay folded in her room for a long time. It was a vibrant, hopeful color, the color of a clear summer sky, and it felt too bold for her. Her own clothes were the colors of dust and shadow, meant to help her fade into the background. But one rainy afternoon, she took it out. She measured and cut, her needle flying with a skill born of long practice. The dress she made was simple, with a high neck and long sleeves. But when she tried it on, the splash of color in her small-looking glass was a shock. It made her eyes seem darker, her skin less pale. For the first time, she did not see a ghost looking back at her. She saw a woman. She wore it to serve dinner that evening. She set the table with her heart pounding, certain Eli would not notice, or worse, that he would mock her for the vanity of it. He came in from the barn, his face weary from a long day, and sat at the table. She placed a bowl of venison stew in front of him, her hands trembling slightly. He looked up, and his eyes met hers. He stopped, the spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at the dress, his gaze traveling from the simple neckline to the hem, and then back up to her face. It was not a man's hungry look, the kind she knew so well. It was soft, his gray eyes losing their hard, stormy edge for a moment. It was a look of quiet appreciation, of seeing something new in the familiar. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. He had thanked her for meals before, but it had always been a perfunctory sound, a matter of habit. This time was different. His eyes were on hers, and his words were imbued with a sincerity that went straight to her heart. "The stew is good." It was the first time she truly believed he meant it. A warm flush spread through her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar she almost mistook it for fear. It was happiness. The peace of those weeks was shattered by the arrival of the circuit rider, a lanky, dust-covered man named Silas who brought mail and news from the wider world. He handed Eli a small stack of letters and a single, brown envelope, a telegram. Eli tore it open, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read the clipped, sparse message. Clara watched his face, and what she saw there made the blood in her veins turn to ice. His jaw tightened, the muscle jumping, and his eyes became hard, flat pieces of granite. Without a word, he handed the flimsy paper to her. Her hands shook as she took it. The words seemed to leap out at her, each one a blow. "Arriving Promise Creek soon. Inquiring after woman answering Clara's description. Reward offered. Jedediah." Jedediah. The name was a key. Unlocking a dark room in her memory she had kept bolted shut. The air left her lungs in a rush. The cabin tilted, the warm, safe world she had started to build crumbling to dust around her. She swayed, and a sharp cry escaped her lips. "Clara!" Eli's voice was sharp, cutting through the roaring in her ears. He was beside her in an instant, his hand on her arm, steadying her. "Who is he?" She could not speak. She could only shake her head, the telegram fluttering from her numb fingers to the floor. He was coming. After all these months, after she had run 1,000 miles, he was still coming for her. "Clara, you have to tell me," Eli insisted, his voice firm but not unkind. He led her to a chair and pushed her gently into it. The story came out in a torrent of whispered, broken sentences, the words tasting like ash and shame in her mouth. She told him everything, about her parents' death in a fire when she was 16, about the uncle who had taken her in, his kindness souring with every bottle of whiskey he drank, about the gambling debts he could not pay, and about the man he had sold her to settle those debts. Jedediah. He owns a place," she stammered, unable to say the word. "In St. Louis, a saloon with rooms upstairs. For men." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet Eli's eyes. "I was not a bride when I came here. Eli, I was never even a willing woman." She confessed it all, the whole sordid, ugly truth. She was not the respectable, hard-working woman from the advertisement. She was damaged goods, a runaway from a brothel, a woman whose body had been treated as a commodity. She braced herself for his disgust, for the contempt that was sure to follow. She expected him to tell her to pack her bag, to throw her out into the wilderness where she belonged. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She dared to look up at him. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to her, one hand resting on the stone mantelpiece, His shoulders were rigid with tension. When he finally turned, his face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were blazing with a cold, hard anger that terrified her. But it was not directed at her. His jaw was tight, the muscle clenching and unclenching. But he did not flinch from her. He did not look at her with revulsion. He looked at her as if he was seeing for the first time the true depth of the wounds she carried. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You're here now," he said, his voice a low, fierce growl. "That's what counts." Her breath hitched on a sob. He did not care about her past. He did not care about what had been done to her. He saw only the woman who was here, now, in his home. His acceptance was a balm on a wound she had thought would never heal. The tears she had held back for years finally came, silent and scalding, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. He did not touch her, but he stayed there, a solid, unshakable presence, until the storm inside her had passed. The next day, he announced they were going to town for supplies. It was not a request. Clara understood it for what it was. A statement. They would not hide. They would face this together. The ride into town was different this time. They were no longer two strangers sharing a wagon bench. They were allies, bound by a shared secret and a common threat. When they walked into Henderson's mercantile, the same women who had whispered about her before fell silent. But this time, Clara did not shrink from their stares. She held her head a little higher, with Eli a solid presence at her side. As they stood at the counter, she felt a small, unfamiliar sensation bubble up inside her. It was a faint memory of a joke Eli had made that morning about a squirrel stealing his biscuits. And for the first time in public, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was a fleeting thing, but several of the townsfolk took notice. They saw not a frightened runaway, but a woman standing beside her husband, a faint light in her eyes. The journey home took them along a narrow, rocky trail that skirted a steep ravine. Eli was riding his tall chestnut gelding, and he had insisted Clara ride a gentle, older mare. As they rounded a sharp bend, a rattlesnake, startled by the horses, coiled and buzzed angrily in the bushes. The mare, usually placid, panicked. It shied violently, whinnying in terror, and bucked hard. Clara, caught off guard, lost her grip on the reins and was thrown. She landed hard on the dusty ground, the air knocked from her lungs. Before she could even register the pain, Eli was off his horse and at her side. "Clara, are you hurt?" He knelt beside her, his face a mask of concern. He ran his hands expertly over her arms and legs, checking for broken bones. "Can you move everything?" She nodded, wincing as she sat up. "I think so, just bruised." He sighed in relief, the sound deep and ragged. Then, with an ease that belied his size, he slid his arms under her back and knees and lifted her as if she were a child. He held her against his chest, her head tucked under his chin. For a moment, he just held her there, his arms a circle of warmth and strength. It was longer than necessary, a moment suspended in time. She could hear the frantic beating of his heart, or perhaps it was her own. He held her a moment too long, and in that extra second, something shifted between them. The careful distance they had maintained was gone, replaced by an undeniable current of feeling. He carried her to his own horse and swung her up into the saddle before mounting behind her. The ride back to the ranch was a strange kind of sweet torture. Her back was pressed against his solid chest, his arms around her holding the reins. With every step the horse took, she was aware of his warmth, his strength, the subtle scent of leather and dust that was uniquely his. She closed her eyes, allowing herself, for the first time, to simply feel safe in a man's embrace. That night at the dinner table, the air was thick with unspoken things. The memory of his arms around her lingered between them. As she reached for the salt, her hand brushed his. The contact was electric. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her face flushing. After the meal, as he was banking the fire for the night, She did something she would never have dared to do before. She reached out and laid her hand gently on top of his as it rested on the table. He froze, his entire body going still. He looked down at her small hand on his, then up at her face. His eyes were dark, questioning. A flicker of something hot and bright passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the charge that had been building for weeks. He did not pull away, but he did not turn his hand over to clasp hers either. He simply allowed the contact. His stillness, a question she did not know how to answer. After a long moment, she slowly withdrew her hand, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Later, as she lay in her narrow bed, she could not sleep. The wind had risen, and it howled around the corners of the cabin like a living thing, a mournful, lonely sound. It sounded like the embodiment of the dangers that lay just outside their door, the threat of Jedediah, the unforgiving nature of the land itself. She rose and crept into the main room. Eli had not gone to his bed. He had fallen asleep in the large chair by the fire, his head slumped to one side, his long legs stretched out before him. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, red light on his sleeping face. In sleep, the hard lines of his face were softened. He looked younger, more vulnerable. She sank into the other chair, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. She sat there for hours, watching him sleep, listening to the wind rage outside. The storm outside and the storm inside her seemed to be in a strange harmony. She looked at this quiet, honorable man who had offered her shelter, who had defended her, who had accepted her shameful past without flinching. She watched the steady rise and fall of his chest and wondered if she was allowed to feel this safe. She wondered if a woman like her was allowed to feel the slow, sweet ache of love that was beginning to bloom in her chest. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the window, she stood up. She moved to his chair, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She hesitated for only a second, then leaned down and pressed a soft, trembling kiss to his weathered cheek. It was a ghost of a touch, as light as a moth's wing. It was not a kiss of passion, but of gratitude, of a deep and burgeoning affection she had no other way to express. He did not wake, he did not stir, but as she straightened up, a faint, slow smile touched his lips in his sleep. The quiet rhythm of their lives held for another week, a fragile peace that felt as precious and precarious as a bird's egg. Clara found herself watching Eli with an unguarded tenderness that both thrilled and terrified her. She saw the way his eyes would soften when he looked at the horses, the gentle way he handled a newborn calf, the quiet satisfaction on his face as he surveyed the land at sunset. She was falling in love with this silent, steady man, and the knowledge was a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of her days. The news, when it came, was not delivered by a formal telegram but by a rider, a neighboring rancher named Abernathy who had been into town. He stopped by on the pretense of discussing a stray steer, but his gaze kept shifting nervously to Clara, who was hanging laundry on the line. "Eli," he said, his voice low as he leaned from his saddle. "There's a man in town, at the saloon, asking questions." Eli went still, his hand resting on the fence post. "What kind of questions?" Abernathy cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on his saddle horn. "Asking about a woman, your wife. Says her name is Lucy, but his description, it matches Mrs. Colton. He's a slick-looking fellow, from back east. Name of Jedediah." The world stopped. The clothespin fell from Clara's numb fingers, and the white sheet she was holding slumped into the dust. Jedediah. He was here, not coming, but here, in Promise Creek, breathing the same air. The fragile piece shattered into a million pieces. A cold, metallic taste filled her mouth. The cage she had escaped from had found her, and the door was swinging shut. "Thank you for the word, John," Eli said, his voice as calm and flat as a stone. He gave no sign of the storm that had just broken over their lives. Abernathy, looking relieved to have delivered his message, nodded curtly and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Clara stood frozen by the clothesline, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. He would come for her. Jedediah was not a man who gave up what he considered his. He was charming on the surface, but underneath, he was cruel and possessive, with powerful friends who saw women as nothing more than livestock to be bought and sold. He would not be deterred by a piece of paper in a faraway courthouse. Eli walked over to her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a solid wall at her back. "Go inside, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She stumbled into the cabin, sinking into a chair at the table. She heard Eli enter the barn. A few minutes later, he returned. He was carrying his Winchester rifle. He laid it on the table and began to methodically, calmly, clean it. The soft, oiled clicks of the mechanism were the only sounds in the room, each one a tick of a clock counting down to a confrontation she could not bear to imagine. "He'll have to come through me," Eli said, not looking at her. His voice was devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. And that was what broke her. The thought of this good, quiet man getting hurt, or worse, because of her, because of the filth of her past, was more than she could stand. She had brought this darkness to his door. She had tainted his peace. She would not be the reason for his ruin. While he was outside checking the perimeter of the ranch, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm, she moved. Her panic gave way to a desperate, single-minded purpose. She flew into her room, her hands shaking so badly she could barely function. She pulled her old valise from under the bed. There was no time to pack properly. She grabbed her spare dress, the paring knife, and the small amount of money she had saved from selling eggs in town. She would run. She would disappear into the wilderness. He would find her gone, and Jedediah would have no reason to stay. Eli would be safe. That was all that mattered. She scribbled a hasty note on a piece of wrapping paper. "I am sorry. Thank you." It was all she could manage. She left it on her pillow, a pathetic monument to the life she was about to abandon. She slipped out the back of the cabin and ran, her worn boots slipping in the loose dirt. She did not head for the road. She headed for the woods that bordered the north end of the property, a tangled wilderness of pine and rock that stretched for miles into the mountains. If she could make it there, she could lose herself. She was almost to the tree line, her lungs burning, tears of terror and grief blinding her, when his voice cut through the air, stopping her as effectively as a physical blow. "Stay." It was a single word, not shouted, but spoken with a low, commanding intensity that vibrated through her very bones. She froze, her back to him, unable to move, unable to breathe. She heard his heavy footsteps close the distance between them. He stopped just behind her. She could feel his presence, his heat, his anger. She braced herself for it. "Turn around, Clara!" Slowly, she forced her trembling body to obey. He was standing a few feet away, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. But beneath the anger, she saw something else, something that stunned her. She saw hurt. "You think I can't protect you?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "It's not that," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't be the reason you get hurt. I won't bring this trouble on you." "You think running is the answer?" he countered, taking a step closer. "You think a man like that just gives up? He'd hunt you down, and you'd be alone. Is that what you want?" "It's better than you dying for me," she cried, the words torn from her. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He looked away from her, his gaze sweeping over the distant, indifferent mountains. He was silent for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was raw, scraped clean of anger, leaving only a deep, ancient pain. "I had a sister," he began, his voice barely audible over the sighing of the wind in the pines. "Her name was Sarah. She was full of light, laughed all the time. She married a man from a town over, a charmer. Turned out he had a mean streak when he drank. I saw the bruises she tried to hide. I told her to leave him. I told her to come home. But she was proud and scared. She kept making excuses for him." He paused, swallowing hard. "One night, they had a fight. He got drunk, knocked over a lamp. The whole house went up in flames. He got out. She didn't." He finally looked back at her, and the agony in his eyes was a physical blow. "I was 20 years old. I stood there and watched her whole world burn. I was too late. I swore on her grave. I swore I'd never let another woman be hurt under my roof. Never again." He fell silent. The story hung in the air between them, a devastating explanation for everything. His quietness, his respect, his fierce, unspoken protectiveness. It was not indifference that had kept him at a distance. It was a vow, sealed in fire and grief. He had not just offered her a business arrangement. He had offered her sanctuary. The one thing he had failed to give his own sister. The last of Clara's strength gave way. A sob, raw and ragged, broke from her lips. The terror, the grief, the overwhelming weight of his confession. It was too much to bear alone. She broke down, her body shaking with violent, racking sobs. This time, he did not hesitate. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. He held her tightly against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other a solid, unshakable wall against her back. She buried her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, her tears soaking through to his skin, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to be held without fear. She did not flinch, she did not brace for a blow. She let her full weight rest against him, and she let him hold the broken pieces of her together. They stood there for a long time, until her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. He did not speak. He just held her, his quiet strength flowing into her, calming the storm inside. The confrontation came 2 days later. They were in the barn, Eli shoeing a horse and Clara mending a harness, when 3 riders appeared at the end of the long track that led to the cabin. The man in the lead was Jedediah. He was just as she remembered, handsome in a slick, predatory way, dressed in a fine city coat that looked out of place in the dusty landscape. Eli straightened up slowly, his face grim. "Clara, go to the house, lock the door, and do not come out, no matter what you hear." She wanted to argue, to stay by his side, but she saw the iron resolve in his eyes. She nodded, her heart pounding, and ran to the cabin, her hand clutching the heavy iron key. She watched from the window, her knuckles white as she gripped the sill. Jedediah and his men dismounted, their movements arrogant and confident. "Colton," Jedediah called out, his voice smooth and oily. "I'm here on a simple matter of business. You have something that belongs to me." Eli stepped out of the barn, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He looked calm, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "The only thing on this ranch that belongs to me is the ranch itself. State your business and get off my land." Jedediah's smile was a sneer. "I'm talking about the girl, Lucy, or Clara, as she may be calling herself. I have a contract, paid her uncle a fair price. She is my property, and I've come to collect—" "She's not property," Eli said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She's my wife, and she's not going anywhere." One of Jedediah's men laughed. "Wife? We know what she is. Colton, don't play the fool." In a flash, the man moved to push past Eli toward the cabin. Eli moved faster. He brought the butt of his rifle up in a short, brutal arc, catching the man under the jaw. The man went down with a grunt. The second man drew a pistol, but Eli was already turning, swinging the heavy barrel of the Winchester, knocking the gun from his hand. Jedediah, seeing his odds change, lunged at Eli. They went down in a tangle of limbs, trading blows in the dust. Eli was stronger, but Jedediah was wiry and fought dirty. He managed to pull a knife, and Clara screamed as she saw the flash of steel. She saw Eli cry out, a sharp exclamation of pain. as Jedediah's knife sliced across his forearm. Enraged, Eli landed a solid punch to Jedediah's jaw, dazing him. Just then, a fourth rider appeared, coming hard down the track. It was the sheriff, a shotgun resting across his saddle. "That's enough," he roared. Jedediah's men, seeing the law had arrived, backed away. Jedediah scrambled to his feet, blood trickling from his lip. "Sheriff, this man has assaulted us," he snarled. "I'm here to reclaim my legal property." "I've heard enough of your claims." "Jedediah," the sheriff said, his voice hard. "I spoke to the judge in Carson City by telegraph this morning. Your contracts aren't worth the paper they're written on in this state. What you're doing is called kidnapping. Eli, you want to press charges?" "I do," Eli said, getting to his feet, blood dripping from his arm into the dust. The sheriff nodded. "Then I've got a warrant for your arrest, Jedediah. For that, and for assault with a deadly weapon." Jedediah's face contorted with rage, but he saw the cold resolve in the sheriff's eyes. He and his men were disarmed and taken into custody, their threats and curses fading as they were led away. As soon as they were gone, Clara flew from the cabin, her locked door forgotten. She ran to Eli, her eyes fixed on the bloody gash on his arm. "You're hurt," she breathed, her hands hovering over the wound, afraid to touch him. "It's just a cut," he said, but his face was pale. She tore a strip from her apron and gently led him into the cabin, pushing him into a chair. She fetched the water basin and whiskey, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the bottle. She cleaned the wound, her touch as gentle as a whisper. He winced, but did not pull away. The gash was deep, oozing blood, and it had narrowly missed the artery. "You could have died," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "You could have died for me." He looked up at her, his stormy eyes soft, and he reached up with his good hand to cup her cheek. His thumb gently wiped away a tear. "You were worth the storm," he replied, his voice a low, rough murmur. His words, his touch, the look in his eyes, it broke through the last of her defenses. She leaned down and kissed him. It was not a tentative, grateful peck on the cheek. It was a slow, trembling, real kiss on the lips. This was not a kiss of hunger or demand. It was a kiss of healing, of gratitude, of a love so profound it ached in her chest. It was a promise, a declaration, and a homecoming, all in one. He kissed her back, a gentle pressure that met her tenderness with his own. That night, after she had bandaged his arm and they had eaten a silent meal, another storm rolled in, the rain drumming a soft, steady rhythm on the roof. She came out of her room to find him staring into the fire. He looked up as she approached. Without a word, she lay down on the thick bearskin rug in front of the hearth. After a moment's hesitation, he lay down beside her, his good arm stretched out, careful not to touch her. They lay there together, fully clothed, watching the flames dance. The silence was no longer empty or awkward. It was full, rich with all the things they had not yet said, but now understood. There were no words. There was just his breath and her breath, the soft patter of the rain, and the closeness of two souls who had weathered a storm and found, for the first time in their lives, a shared and lasting peace. The peace they found was not a quiet, placid thing. It was a living, breathing entity that they had to nurture in the vast, echoing silence of the plains. They lay by the fire on that first night, and many nights after, the space between them shrinking until one evening. Her head found its way to his shoulder, and his arm, the one that was not injured, came to rest around her. It was a simple, profound comfort, a silent acknowledgement that the walls between them had finally, irrevocably, crumbled. In this newfound safety, Clara began to unfurl. The woman who had arrived in Promise Creek with her head bowed and her spirit stitched shut began to stand a little taller. The change was first noticeable in her own small domain. Her herb garden thrived. a patch of defiant green against the dusty brown, and she would bring small bouquets of mint and lavender into the cabin, filling the small space with a clean, hopeful scent. Then the change began to radiate outward. On a trip into town, she stood in Henderson's Mercantile, enduring the now familiar whispers of the town's more pious women. One of them, a Mrs. Gable with a face like a sour plum, commented loudly to her companion, "I hear she's taken to gardening. A pity she can't grow a better reputation." The old Clara would have shrunk, her face burning with shame, and fled the store. But this Clara, the woman who had been defended by Eli and who had tended his wound, simply turned. She did not raise her voice. She looked Mrs. Gable directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and steady. "Mr. Henderson sells herbs. Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a distinct chill. "Not gossip. Perhaps you are in the wrong establishment." A shocked silence fell over the store. Mrs. Gable's jaw dropped. Before she could muster a reply, Clara turned back to the counter, paid for her goods, and walked out, her back straight. She did not know where the words had come from, but they felt true and right in her mouth. They tasted of self-respect. She began to build other small bridges. The Abernathys, their closest neighbors, had a young daughter, Lily, a shy girl of 10 with wide, curious eyes. When Mrs. Abernathy came by to trade eggs for some of Clara's herbs, Clara noticed the girl tracing the letters on a feed sack with a finger. On their next visit, Clara brought out her own worn book. "Would you like to learn to read them?" she asked the girl gently. Lily's face lit up with a brilliant, unreserved joy. And so, twice a week, Lily would ride over, and they would sit on the cabin porch, Clara patiently guiding the girl through the mysteries of the alphabet. She was teaching, contributing, becoming a part of the fabric of this small community in a way she never thought possible. The intimacy with Eli deepened in a way that was as slow and natural as the changing of the seasons. The arrangement of their separate rooms began to feel artificial, a relic of a time that no longer existed. One night, a nightmare, a vicious echo of her past, left her waking with a scream lodged in her throat, her body drenched in a cold sweat. She found herself standing in the main room, trembling in the moonlight. When his door opened, he saw her, and the concern on his face was immediate and absolute. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply said, his voice thick with sleep, "There's room in my bed, Clara, not for anything else, just if you need to not be alone." It was an offer of pure comfort. With no demands attached, she nodded, unable to speak, and followed him into his room. His bed was larger than hers, the mattress filled with straw and feathers, and it smelled of him, a clean scent of sun and leather. She lay down stiffly on the far edge, and he lay beside her, on his back, a respectful distance between them. But in the darkness, he reached out and took her hand. His grasp was warm and steady. He said nothing more, and in the simple, silent communion of their joined hands, the shadows of her nightmare receded, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep for the first time in years. It did not become a nightly habit, but on the nights when the wind howled a little too loudly, or the weight of the past felt a little too heavy, one of them would wordlessly seek out the other. Sometimes they would lie and talk in low voices, sharing small pieces of their histories. Other times they would simply lie in the comfortable silence, their backs pressed together. The simple contact a reassurance that they were not alone. They were building a marriage from the inside out, starting not with passion, but with the quiet, sturdy bricks of trust and solace. News of her defiance against Jedediah had spread through the territory like a grass fire. In the eyes of many of the women, especially the ones on the isolated ranches who knew the harsh realities of a woman's life, she was a hero. They looked at her with a new respect, a kind of awe. But among some of the men, there was a different reaction, They saw a woman who had defied a man's claim, a woman who had been defended when, in their eyes, her past made her indefensible. They looked at Eli with a mixture of pity and resentment, and at Clara with suspicion. She was a disruption to the natural order of things, and they did not like it. The fragile peace was threatened when the sheriff rode out to the ranch one afternoon, his face grim. Jedediah had escaped. He had overpowered a deputy during a transfer and vanished. "He's smart, and he's got money," the sheriff warned them, his gaze resting on Clara with concern. "And he's the kind to hold a grudge. He made some threats before he left, said he'd be back to finish his business." The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was a living thing, a predator circling in the darkness just beyond the firelight. The old fear, the familiar companion of her past, tried to reassert its hold on Clara. But this time, something was different. She was not alone. That evening, she found Eli by the corral, his face set in hard lines. "I will not run again," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I will not be helpless either. Teach me." He turned to her, a question in his eyes. "Teach me to shoot," she clarified. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a single, decisive nod. The lessons began the next day. He started her with the Winchester, the same rifle he had used to defend her. It was heavy and awkward in her arms, the cold steel a foreign weight. Her first shots were clumsy, missing the tin can he had set on a fence post by a wide margin. The recoil bruised her shoulder, and the loud report made her flinch. "You're closing your eyes," he told her, his voice patient. He came to stand behind her, his large frame a shield against the wind. "You can't hit what you can't see." He adjusted her stance, his hands on her shoulders. Then he reached around her, his arms encircling hers, to help her hold the heavy rifle steady. His chest was warm against her back, his chin brushing the top of her head as he sighted down the barrel with her. "Breathe out slow," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it." His closeness was a distraction, a warm current that spread through her, making it hard to concentrate. But she listened, she focused, she breathed, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and in the distance, the tin can jumped and spun. A small hole punched cleanly through its center. A gasp of surprise and satisfaction escaped her. She had done it. "Good," he said, his voice a low rumble in her ear. He did not move away immediately. They stood there for a moment, wrapped in the scent of gunpowder and the shared victory of her small accomplishment. She was learning to wield power, to face a threat, to respect the tool but not to fear it. A month later, the town held a gathering to celebrate the harvest, a rare occasion for the scattered ranchers and townsfolk to come together. There was a barn dance with fiddles and laughter and tables groaning with food. Eli, to her surprise, insisted they go. Clara wore her blue calico dress. She felt the familiar stares as they entered the brightly lit barn. But for the first time, she felt Eli's hand rest possessively on the small of her back. He led her through the crowd, nodding to acquaintances, his message clear to anyone who looked. "This is my wife, and she is with me." The preacher, a well-meaning man named Reverend Johnson, approached them. "Eli, good to see you. And this must be your good lady." He stumbled over the words, his uncertainty a reflection of the town's own. Eli's hand tightened ever so slightly on her back. He looked the preacher in the eye, and his voice, though quiet, was filled with a gentle, unmistakable pride. "Reverend," he said, "this is my wife, Clara." He said the words simply, without fanfare, but they landed with the force of a vow spoken before God and the entire town. He was not just claiming her in name, but with his heart. He was erasing the shame, overriding the whispers with his own unwavering truth. Clara felt a warmth bloom in her chest so intense it almost brought tears to her eyes. Later that night, back in the quiet of their cabin, the emotions of the evening still swirling around them. She knew she had to speak her own truth. He was sitting by the fire, tending to the last of the embers. When she came to stand before him, "Eli," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "When I came here, I came because I had to. It was a place to run, a place to hide. I stayed because you were kind, because you were safe." She took a deep, shaky breath. "But that's not why I want to stay now." He looked up at her, his stormy eyes questioning in the firelight. "I want to stay because you are here," she whispered, the words coming from the deepest part of her soul. "I want to choose you. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I do. I could go anywhere, and I would still choose this. I would still choose you." He rose slowly to his feet, his gaze never leaving hers. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his palms rough but his touch incredibly tender. He searched her eyes, and in them, he saw the absolute, unconditional truth of her words. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not like their first kiss, the one born of relief and gratitude. This was something else entirely. It was a kiss that had been held back, a kiss that had been waiting behind years of his loneliness and months of her fear. It was tender, aching, and slow. A question she had been waiting a lifetime to answer. It deepened. No longer just a kiss of comfort, but one of passion, of a profound and soul-deep longing finally unleashed. His kiss was quiet but consuming, like a storm that had waited years to finally break and fall. He swept her into his arms and carried her to his bed, and there, in the soft light of the moon filtering through the window, they made love for the first time. It was a joining not just of bodies, but of two scarred and lonely souls who had finally found their harbor. Every touch was a discovery, every caress a prayer. It was a tender, aching, beautiful healing. The next morning, Clara rose and walked to the small looking glass in her room. The woman who stared back was a stranger. Her eyes were clear. Her lips were soft and slightly swollen from his kisses, and there was a quiet, luminous glow to her skin. The haunted, frightened girl was gone. This was not the broken thing Jedediah had owned. This was not the bought bride who had stepped off the train. This was a woman remade, forged in kindness, tempered by courage, and finally, claimed by love. A hard knock on the door later that morning announced the sheriff. His face was grim. "He's been seen," he said, without preamble. "Jedediah, spotted by a trapper up in the hills, not 10 miles from here. He's coming. Eli, he's coming for her." Eli nodded, his hand instinctively going to the rifle that now rested above the mantelpiece. Clara turned from the window. Her heart was pounding, a hard, steady drumbeat of resolve, not fear. She looked at the rifle, then at Eli, the man she had chosen, the man who had chosen her. She would not hide. She would not cower. She gripped the stock of her own rifle, the one she now knew how to use. Her hands were steady. "She won't run." The days that followed the sheriff's warning were fraught with a heavy, watchful silence. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Every snap of a twig, every distant cry of a hawk, sent a jolt of tension through Clara. But the fear was different now. It was not the cowering, helpless terror of her past. It was a sharp, focused alertness, the vigilance of a she-wolf guarding her den. She and Eli moved through their days in a state of quiet solidarity, their conversations sparse but their glances full of unspoken understanding. The rifles were never far from reach. The attack came at dusk, the time of day when the world blurs, when shadows lengthen and trick the eye. They had just finished their evening meal. Eli was at the water pump, washing the dust of the day from his hands and face, and Clara was on the porch, watching the sky bleed from orange to a deep, bruised purple. It was a moment of profound peace, the kind they had fought so hard to build. And that is when she saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the dying light. cresting the low rise at the edge of their property. They were not moving at the easy gait of neighbors. They were coming fast, their intent as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass. "Eli," she said, her voice low and steady, all the air gone from her lungs. He looked up, saw the direction of her gaze, and his whole body went rigid. He did not run for the cabin. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers, a silent, unmovable object standing between his home and the approaching threat. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Bar the door." But Clara did not move. She had spent a lifetime running, a lifetime hiding behind locked doors. Not again. She backed into the cabin, but it was to retrieve her own rifle, the one Eli had taught her to use. Her hands were cold, but they did not shake as she checked the load. She took up a position at the window, the heavy barrel resting on the sill, just as Eli had shown her. The riders fanned out as they approached, their faces becoming clear in the gloom. Jedediah was in the center, a cruel smirk on his lips. He reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin. "Evening, Colton," Jedediah called out, his voice dripping with false civility. "I've come back for what's mine. Send her out, and we can end this peacefully." "You'll get nothing here but a grave," Eli answered, his own rifle now held at the ready. One of Jedediah's men, a brutish figure with a pockmarked face, laughed and began to raise his own weapon. He was aiming for Eli. Time seemed to slow. Clara saw the man's intention, saw the dark maw of his rifle barrel begin to lift. She remembered Eli's voice in her ear. "Breathe out slow. Squeeze the trigger." She did not think. She acted. She lined up her sights on the man's shoulder, a large and forgiving target. She breathed out, and she squeezed. The roar of her rifle shattered the evening quiet. The man cried out, a sharp, surprised yelp, and he was thrown from his saddle, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the sky as he fell, clutching a shoulder that was suddenly blossoming with red. The shot broke the standoff. The second man spurred his horse forward, firing wildly toward Eli, who dove behind the water trough, returning fire with a calm, deadly accuracy that forced the man to seek cover behind the corral fence. Jedediah, his face a mask of fury at this unexpected resistance, saw his chance. While Eli was pinned down, he dismounted and ran, not toward the gunfight, but toward the barn. He knew she was in the cabin, but the barn was a place of shadows, a place of traps. He meant to corner her. Clara saw him go. A cold dread, far worse than the fear of the gunfight, washed over her. She looked at Eli, who was methodically reloading, keeping the second man pinned. He was holding his own. She had to face Jedediah herself. This was her fight. She slipped out the back of the cabin, her rifle clutched in her hands, and circled around toward the barn side entrance. She moved through the deepening twilight, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She entered the cavernous, hay-scented darkness of the barn and waited, her back pressed against a rough wooden stall. She heard him enter through the main doors, a large, dark silhouette against the last of the evening light. "Lucy," he crooned, his voice a sick parody of affection. He still used that name, the name he had given her, the name of his property. "I know you're in here. There's no point in hiding. You belong to me. You always have." She remained silent, her breath held tight in her chest. "You've been playing house with this dirt scratcher, haven't you?" he continued, his voice taking on a sharper, crueler edge as he moved deeper into the barn. "Did you really think you could wash the stink of St. Louis off you? You're a spoiled whore. Lucy, nothing more. I bought you and I own you." His words were poison darts, meant to find the old wounds, the old shame. And they did. She felt a tremor run through her, a phantom ache of the life she had escaped. She was trembling, but it was with a rage so pure and cold it burned. She thought of Eli's sister, Sarah. She thought of the gentle way Eli had held her hand in the dark. She thought of the pride in his voice when he had called her his wife. She stepped out from behind the stall, the rifle held steady in her hands. Jedediah stopped, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "There you are!" She stood 20 feet from him, the last rays of light from the hayloft window illuminating the dust motes dancing between them. She was trembling, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and hard and carried the weight of her entire journey. "I'm not yours," she said. "I never was." His smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of pure fury. "You ungrateful bitch!" he hissed, and he lunged at her, his hand raised to strike. She did not flinch. She did not close her eyes. She raised the rifle, aimed at his leg, and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Jedediah screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and outrage, and crumpled to the ground, clutching a shattered kneecap. He stared at her from the dirt floor, his eyes wide with disbelief and hate. He had come to collect his property, and his property had just shot him. The barn doors burst open. Eli stood there, his rifle raised, his face a mask of grim concern. He took in the scene, Clara standing, smoke curling from her rifle barrel, and Jedediah writhing on the ground. A moment later, the sheriff appeared behind him, shotgun in hand, the second gunman already in custody. Relief washed over Clara, so potent it made her knees weak. The rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She lowered it, her strength gone, and Eli was there, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her back from the abyss. The town gathered, drawn by the sound of gunfire. They saw the sheriff leading Jedediah and his men away in chains. They saw Clara, standing on her own 2 feet, with her husband's arm around her. And for once, the law and the truth stood with her. The whispers that rippled through the crowd that night were not of shame or suspicion. They were of awe. The women, especially, looked at her differently. They saw not a fallen woman, but a survivor. They saw a woman who had fought back. A week later, when the dust had settled and a quiet peace had returned to the ranch, Clara walked to the small, wind-swept hill where Eli's family was buried. She found the simple wooden cross that marked Sarah's grave. The name was faded, the wood weathered by years of sun and snow. Clara knelt and placed a single, wild blue columbine at the base of the cross, the color a stark, beautiful contrast to the dry grass. "He told me about you," she whispered to the silent earth. "You were full of light." She paused, her hand resting on the weathered wood. "The world, it tried to put my light out, too." She took a deep, shaky breath. "You didn't survive, but I did, and I'll carry both our names now, I promise." Months passed. The harshness of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. Clara and Eli rebuilt the section of fence that had been broken in the fight. They worked side by side, a comfortable, easy silence between them, their movements a practiced dance. Her garden flourished, spilling over its borders with herbs and late-season vegetables, and she shared its bounty with her neighbors. The reading classes she held for Lily Abernathy had grown. 3 other women from nearby ranches now came twice a week, their faces earnest and hungry for knowledge as they gathered on Clara's porch. She was no longer just a resident of this land, she was a part of its heart. One late afternoon, a final storm of the season rolled across the plains. The sky turned a magnificent, bruised purple, and the air grew heavy with the scent of rain. The old Clara would have run inside, cowering from the thunder. But this Clara walked out onto the porch and then into the yard. She stood with her face turned to the sky, her arms wide, and she let the first cool, heavy drops of rain hit her face. It was not a storm to be feared. It was a cleansing, a release, a baptism in the wild, beautiful and unforgiving land that she now called home. She heard the cabin door open and close. Eli came to stand beside her in the rain. He did not speak, but his presence was a warm and steady anchor. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead and ran in rivulets down his weathered face. He looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with a love so deep and quiet it took her breath away. He reached out and tilted her chin up, and he kissed her. It was a slow, tender kiss, with the weight of everything they had weathered held within it. The fear, the pain, the fight, the quiet moments of healing. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and earth and forever. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. Her eyes closed, the rain cool on her skin. "I didn't know what love was," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming of the rain. "Until you waited for me to feel it." Thank you for gathering around our campfire and listening to this story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect with one another. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.